Are you able to hear us and can you communicate with us?
This is Andrea Cass, and I just joined the meeting.
Okay, we're just in the beginning stages, Andrea, and we're reading the required orders, required notice from established by the governor. So we've established that members of the public and the applicant are able to access us. So I find that we do have public access to the meeting, and at least for now, we can go forward.
Thank you.
Yep, thank you. Please note that all votes that are taken during this meeting shall be done by roll call vote. Ms. McLaughlin, we're going to start the meeting by taking a roll call attendance. When each member states their presence, also please state whether there is anyone in the room with you during this meeting, which is required under the right to know law.
Okay. Charles Putnam, Chair.
Yes, I am here, and the only other living creature with me is my dog.
John Hinsman, Vice Chair.
I'm here alone in my building, which at one time used to be a funeral parlor, and there's rumors of ghosts, but to the best of my knowledge, I'm alone in my room.
Sue Nastasi. Oh, unmute.
Okay. All right. Sue Nastasi. I'm at home. Right now, I'm by myself. My cats or my husband could be in and out.
Okay. Nathaniel Leach, alternate.
I'm here. I'm in my house. I have headphones on, but my wife is in the kitchen 10 feet away.
Herb Ueda.
I'm here and alone.
Tom Clark.
Oh. And you're muted, Mr. Clark.
Okay, now I'm here and in the room by myself.
Okay, so roll call is accomplished.
Okay, and Mr. Leach, when we get to our public hearing this evening, Ms. Mears is not here, so you'll be a full voting member of the board for that variance petition. So there are additional instructions. This Google meeting is being recorded, and it's very important that only one person speak at a time. We've all had some practice now in muting and unmuting our microphones. That's to keep the audio signal understandable for everybody. I'll try to pay close attention to the video. If you'd like to speak, raise a hand to signal that you'd like to speak. If you are joining the meeting by phone, I'll try to be sure to create a time to make it easier for you to speak and to announce that we're, say, taking comments from abutters or comments from interested members of the public. Mr. Martell, I understand that you're joining us by phone. I think you're doing the right thing by leaving your phone unmuted, because there will be many points at which we'll give you a chance to respond. But if you could wait for me to prompt you to say, would you like to respond to that, Mr. Martell? That'll help us to create a clear record. There are portions of the meeting for the applicant, board members, and abutters to speak, and I'll try to be clear in directing traffic for that. Please be aware that board members and the applicant have more opportunities to ask questions and respond to questions and comments. I would expand that to Mr. Clark, who is the town building and code enforcement officer. He has specialized technical expertise that is relevant to the board, and I may create additional opportunities for Mr. Clark to address the board and respond to our questions. Although Google Meet has a chat function, please don't use the chat function to comment on the hearing or to ask to be recognized. I'm multitasking here and I can't keep track of chat and watch the video. In one instance, abutters have sent emails stating their position, and that is helpful to us. If the abutters who have sent emails join us, they don't have to repeat what's in the email, but they also have an opportunity to present additional information that they want to share orally at the appropriate time in this meeting or in this hearing. And last but not least, I really appreciate the board, the public, the applicants' patience and flexibility with this process. It's still fairly new to all of us, and at times it appears cumbersome and slow, but we're trying to take special care to protect the rights of the applicant, the abutters, the town, and the public. Board members, if you feel overwhelmed at any point in this hearing or in this meeting, I'll try to address your question, but it may be necessary to continue the meeting to address board members' ability to function effectively in this process. So the first item of business before us tonight is public hearing 20-03. Ms. McLaughlin, I'll ask you to provide the clerk's report on the first case.
So this is case 2003, in which Paul Martell of 92 Old Mill Lane is seeking a variance from section 8.1.3.9, multiple dwellings, two-family dwellings, accessory dwellings, and renting of rooms in accordance with section 8.1.3.17 to allow for the construction of an accessory dwelling unit in an unattached structure at tax map 3, lot 7-1, located at 92 Old Mill Lane.
And how was public notice and personal notice provided?
The abutters were noticed via certified mail. The notice was posted in Foster's Daily Democrat on May 14th, 2020. And the notice was also posted at various places around town.
Okay. And I probably just overlooked that we provided personal notice by certified mail return receipt requested.
Yes.
Okay. Mr. Martell, this is the portion of the hearing for you to explain to us what it is that you're hoping to do and why you filed the application for a variance with the board.
Okay, you can hear me?
We can, thank you.
Yes, basically we're looking for, down the road, if something happens to either my wife or I, that we'd like to, with the size property we have and everything, just to have like an in-law or a caretaker apartment in the back for possibly one of our children to come in and help take care of us. We love living here. We want to stay here, but I think the best option for us is to have that ability to, if something happens, we can either move down into a smaller building and have one of the children or a caretaker come in and help us out, or just just thinking of down the road. And I said that's in order to keep us here.
Okay. I'll ask members of the board for questions, but one thing I would like to clarify, I think when Ms. McLaughlin read the notice, it cited 8.1.3.17, which provides that an appeal shall be made to the Zoning Board of Appeals. And my understanding is that you're applying for a variance from 8.1.3.9, accessory dwelling must be attached to the primary dwelling unit. Accessory dwelling units are not permitted in detached accessory structures on the same lot. Is that your understanding, Mr. Martell?
Yes.
Okay. And a little later on, I won't ask you, well, I will ask you, but don't feel like you have to be an expert on our ordinance, Mr. Martell. There is a provision 8.1.3.18 that says that accessory dwellings shall be allowed in a detached accessory structure that is in existence prior to the adoption of this ordinance. So my first question to you is, when was your home built?
We purchased it 9 years ago. I don't know. The house has been here I would say since the 60s. I'm not really sure. We've been here 9 years.
Oh, okay. So don't worry about it. We'll put Mr. Clark on the spot in a little bit. But I'll turn it over. I'll call board members one by one to ask any questions that they have of you. And they'll go one by one, and I'll call them by name. Mr. Ueda.
I don't have any questions at all.
Okay. Ms. Nastasi.
No, not at this time. No questions.
Mr. Leach.
My only question would be to your comment, Charlie, is this is to section 18, not 17? Appeals to the.
It's actually, it's
It's 18.
0.9.
Okay. No, I'm good.
Okay, Mr. Hinsman.
No questions.
No questions. So if I could take some leeway before we get to a butter and public comment, Mr. Clark, are you able to shed any light for us on whether the accessory building predates the adoption of our ordinance?
I'm fairly certain that we need to check with Mr. Martell, but the unit you want to build, Paul, is going to be in the garage, right?
It's off the back of my garage, yes.
Right. And the garage was built only, what, 5 or 6 years ago?
Yes.
Yeah. So, Mr. Chairman, it's the building does not predate the ordinance.
Okay. Just to follow up on that, it does appear that the requirement that there, let's see, in order to get a variance, there has to be some provision of the ordinance that would block what Mr. Martell wants to do, and 8.1.3.9 does block what he wants to do.
Correct.
Okay. And just while we have you on deck, Mr. Clark, do you have any additional technical input for the board?
Well, Mr. Martell and I discussed this at great length a number of times, and we discussed his options, one of which being he could do a subdivision to put a separate lot on this property. But he did not want to do that because it was going to be primarily family and or caregivers for his family. He didn't want to open up the possibility of have additional development. And so he decided to choose this route to be able to, accomplish his objective, is having that unit in a detached garage for himself and his family.
Okay. Thank you. And I apologize. Mr. Martell, there is a question that I wanted to ask. And I'm going to be pretty direct about it. I don't mean it to be an insulting question, but back in the days when I was on the planning board, we used to worry a lot about this kind of development because, I hope that you and your wife have a long life and live in this town for another 50 years. But there's no legal obligation if the accessory apartment is built. The town really won't have a way to prevent you from renting it out or preventing the person who buys the house from you from renting it out. And I guess my question is, again, I don't mean that to be an insulting question, but from your perspective, is there anything that you can think of that will protect the town from the risk that you, or more likely the person who buys it from you and your wife, decides that this would make a great rental property?
The only thing I can do personally is give you my word that that's not my intention. I am not looking for any rental or any money out of this. If there's something you need in writing just to further down the road, if you're worried about that, I'd be willing to sign a release saying that is when Barbara and I there's no longer family involved in this property, that will not become a rental property. I will I will do that if need be. I'm not looking for a rental. I'm not looking for. I'm just trying to protect, trying to keep my wife and I to stay here the best we can, and I think that's a good route for us to go.
Sure. Thank you very much. Mr. Clark wants to provide additional information to the board.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chair. Since this is a variance, the zoning board can attach any reasonable condition that it finds. So if you wanted to do that, perhaps ask Mr. Martell not only do something in writing, but make a deed restriction. I think that would be a reasonable request.
Thank you, Mr. Clark. And Mr. Martell, I'll give you an opportunity to respond. Would that be something that you would be inclined to agree to, that in addition to putting it in writing, you'd be willing to put a restriction on the deed that would prevent successor owners from renting out the accessory apartment?
Absolutely.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Martell. So with gratitude to members of the public who have waited to address the board or to ask questions, Ms. Cass, I'll recognize you first.
I have no comments. Thank you, Charlie.
Okay, and Mr. Arkwell, you indicated before that you were here to observe, but you're welcome to ask any questions. I have a very expansive policy of recognizing members of the public who take the time and trouble to hear and to listen in.
No, it's really nothing to do with me. I was just curious how the meetings work, and I figured this would be a good opportunity to view it.
Okay, thanks for your participation. Any further questions from members of the board? All right, Mr. Martell, any final things that you'd like the board to have in mind as we move from the public hearing into our deliberations?
No, I believe, I think I'm all set. Thank
All
you.
right. Okay. So we're in the part of the hearing where the chair is supposed to provide a summary setting forth the facts of the case. And I'll try to do that very, very briefly. Mr. Martell is the owner of a home and accessory building, a garage at 92 Old Mill Lane in Rollinsford, together with his wife, who appears to be a trustee of that property. And they have requested a variance from 8.1.3.9 to establish a so-called in-law apartment or accessory apartment to the rear of the garage. And they have indicated a willingness to certify to the board in writing and to agree to a deed restriction indicating that the property, that the accessory apartment could not be available for rent. And I assume that the house wouldn't be rented either. So with that, Mr. Martell, did I get anything wrong?
No, I believe you've done a wonderful job.
All right, thank you very much. So the hearing on this variance appeal is closed, and the board will move into deliberation on the application. And I'll begin deliberation with Mr. Hinsman. John, you're muted. There you go.
I muted myself. I'm inclined to support it with with a restriction in the deed that the accessory apartment not be rented out, and I don't know if you can say that the house not be rented out away, but I suppose we can't say that, but I'm generally in favor of it.
Okay, Ms. Nastasi. Oops, I'm sorry. There you go.
Yeah, I couldn't hear Mr. Hinsman well, but I wanted to ask, so the deed restriction will be part of the variance?
We're in deliberations now. The board has not reached a decision. So
Okay,
I think what Mr. Hinsman was saying, that he would be in favor of granting the variance subject to that condition.
Yes, okay, yes, I agree.
Okay. Mr. Leach.
So am I correct that we can't restrict the house from being rented in this variance since it specifically has to do with the accessory dwelling unit? Or can that be part of this?
Um,
And let me follow up with that. My other thought is this being an in-law, per se unit, would we be inclined to say it could be rented to family, or restrict rentals altogether? I know in times where an in-law apartment, let's say, I want my father to move into the house. He's willing to pay me something for that. It could be extremely helpful for a young family, or some scenario. I would like to keep the best interest of Rollinsford at heart, keeping it a family, in-law unit, but not limit the economics to it, because I think that can be beneficial to some.
okay. Mr. Ueda.
I'm not in favor of it because it doesn't meet the criteria for a variance, specifically the criteria that says you need to show hardship if we don't grant it. And this deed restriction, I would be very uncomfortable making any decision tonight unless we further understood the legal ramifications and the validity of such a restriction in perpetuity. And there's one other piece. So in other words, until we prove to ourselves that that's a legally sound method and it's tried and true and been used and not challenged, I think we'd be remiss in even voting on that. Maybe you guys can educate me on the fly. But then finally, if you were to go all that route, there's nothing stopping someone from basically creating, let's say we approve it as an accessory dwelling unit. Let's say we restrict the deed. When you go to sell the property, what I would do, trying to maximize my, what I could get from my house, I would then seek to subdivide it and sell the apartment as a separate unit, as a separate house altogether. That way you would absolutely maximize, your return. I'm not saying Mr. Martell has any intent to do any of this, but I'm just saying the public at large, if they watch the results of a hearing, that follows this pattern, could easily surmise that that's a good 2 or 3 step process for kind of backdoor subdividing. Go ahead, Tom. You look like you want to talk.
Yes, thank you. I just wanted to explain that in my experience, a condition such as this is certainly binding and legal. I've been witness to many zoning meetings where the zoning board has attached, it's tough to do it with a special exception, but with a variance, the applicant is asking you guys to do stuff that he can't do without your approval. So you, as a zoning board, have the right to attach any reasonable condition, especially a condition that the applicant agrees with. And as far as your second concern, I agree, someone could subdivide it, but in that case, the variance would be rendered moot because the variance is for the principal lot where the house is. If he were to subdivide it, it was put as separate dwelling unit on a separate lot, and the variance wouldn't be necessary anymore, so it would be basically rendered moot.
Okay, but Tom, wouldn't wouldn't the propensity for a future board to grant the approval of a subdivision where it otherwise might be dicey, if somebody had already invested a significant amount of money to build a livable dwelling unit on that new, not what is they're proposing to be a new lot? So in other words, you're kind of incentivizing that investment up front, knowing that it's more likely, it seems to me, to be way more likely to approve, someone subdividing a lot such as that, as opposed to, I just want to split up my land because I want to build a house on it.
I guess I don't understand the question, Herb.
I'm always thinking like a realtor and an investor.
Right.
If I thought I could build a small shed in my backyard, a few years later, turn it into an in-law apartment, a few years later, grow it to have 2 or 3 rooms, and then a decade or 20 years later, with a completely different set of zoning board adjustment people, go in for approval to subdivide it as a whole new house. That's the ideal way to maximize your investment. And again, I'm not at all saying Mr. Martell's trying to do this. I'm just saying that would seem to me to be a great way to slowly circumvent the zoning ordinance.
I'm going to step in here, and I appreciate both Mr. Ueda's deliberative comments and Mr. Clark's effort to provide additional technical information for us. But Herb, what I think I'll do is I want to make sure that deliberation is for the board and not turn it into a conversation with you and Mr. Clark if I can. So are there do you have additional points that you want to make in terms of how you're thinking about voting on this matter?
No, I would go right back to the 5 criteria, which it meets 4, but not the 5th, which is failure to show undue hardship.
Okay. And I guess I'll take a point. I appreciate the comments that everyone has made, and I appreciate the spirit in which Mr. Martell has approached us. I too am worried about the unnecessary hardship, but let me think aloud for a minute, because my mind isn't made up, and I think I want to hear from the rest of the board. RSA 674:33 is the statute that gives us the authority to grant a variance, and the 5 requirements are: the variance will not be contrary to the public interest, the spirit of the ordinance is observed, substantial justice is done, the values of surrounding properties are not diminished, and literal enforcement of provisions of the ordinance would result in an unnecessary hardship. The statute goes on to flesh out unnecessary hardship by saying it means that owing to special conditions of the property that distinguish it from other properties in the area, no fair and substantial relationship exists between the general public purposes of the ordinance provision and the specific application of that provision to the property, and the proposed use is a reasonable one. And again, I'm still thinking aloud, but I want to share my thinking with the board and hear further deliberation. I guess working up from the bottom of the list, it seems like Mr. Martell has made a strong case that this is a reasonable use. He's hopes to age in place, hopes to be able to have family members come and help care for him and his wife, or have other caregivers come and help support them as they age in place, which is a perfectly reasonable use of the property. Fair and substantial relationship exists between our prohibition on detached dwelling units and its application to this particular property. And here's where I start to get kind of wrapped around the axle. As I drive around town, I see quite a few detached in-law apartments. And I know that the town, again, I'm so old now that my experience on the planning board goes back to 1988. Pretty much since I hit the planning board in 1988, we've struggled with this whole question. And I think Mr. Ueda has articulated it well. It's not that Mr. Martell, I mean, he's our neighbor. We see him, you know, pretty much on a weekly basis. We've no reason to disbelieve him. It's just that circumstances change and owners change, sometimes in ways that make it hard to predict how these dwellings evolve. But we do have a bunch of them in town. We also have 8.1.3.18, which says if you happen to predate the ordinance, we're going to let you do it. And that's where I start to see, I don't know that I guess it seems to me that it's hard to make a rational distinction for why we would allow it for pre-existing buildings, but then completely prohibit it for, you know, buildings like this garage that were built within the last 5 years. It looks as, in terms of diminishing the property values, there are no abutter comments to the contrary. Nobody is complaining about it. The spirit of the ordinance is one of the places where we get into difficult conversations because we worry about precedent. We worry about what kind of an example we're setting for the town if we grant a variance. But I guess here, Mr. Martell has offered a pretty extraordinary self-imposed condition that he's not going to rent that. He's going to agree not to rent the accessory apartment, and he's going to agree to a restriction, that a deed restriction, that the owner of the primary residence can't rent the accessory unit. I don't think it's contrary to the public interest, in part because we have, we have a number of them around, and this is a reasonable use, you know, a residential use of the property. So that's a lot. I apologize for speaking at such length, but it's a long way around to say I'm still open-minded. I'm interested to hear further comment and deliberation from the board. Mr. Ueda, you had your hand up, and then Mr. Leach. Mr. Ueda.
I didn't intentionally have my hand up, but I do have comment, and that would be, I can only guess that the section in the ordinance that talks to existing structures is to make amends, or to show some leniency towards, you know, places that were pseudo livable and just needed some upgrades. You know, the room over the garage that just needed a bathroom installed, or a stove to make it livable, versus the allowance, the general allowance, if you will, to construct new stuff, you know, on a new footprint. That makes perfect sense to me, especially in the urban and, you know, the urban residential and the non-countryside residential, the other two zones that are more dense. That makes perfect sense. It's there to discourage people from growing their property by virtue of creating this accessory dwelling unit. That's the way I read it.
Okay, Mr. Leach.
As I look at, and you referred to section 18 of the ordinance, if it had predated the ordinance, it's really clear that there'd be no increase in the space. As I look at the sketch provided to the board, he's choosing to double it, greater than double it, by adding basically another bay of the garage. I'm not sure I'm allowed to do this. This is my, you know, I'm fairly new to the board. Would it be, could we ask that he use that existing space to create the dwelling unit, opposed to doubling the size of the space, as it says in 18B, no net increase in building footprint. I know he's not getting a variance on 18, but to follow that thought, you know, use the existing footprint opposed to doubling it. Would that appeal to other members of the board?
guess let me ask Mr. Martell first how he feels about that.
Yeah, could you explain that again, please?
Go ahead, Mr. Leach.
So the sketch that you've provided, you have an existing garage. You're asking to sort of double the size of that garage by putting the apartment in the back and adding another garage off to the left of it, ultimately more than doubling the size of the existing structure. Whereas if your garage did predate the ordinance, what would be allowed would be for you to turn that garage into an apartment, but not increase the current footprint. So would you consider taking your existing footprint and using that to create the accessory unit?
No, for the fact that I have small machinery that I keep in there. The garage basically is full. It's a 3-bay garage. Basically, it's full with a small loader, a mower, all my everything I need to work around here. So, and it doesn't have a second floor. It's an open ceiling. So that really is not what I'm looking for. I think the building off the back suits much better for what I want to do. How about if the garage is an issue, I could eliminate the garage. But as far as in the back, doubling it just makes more sense for. I don't want to put like you were talking before. I don't want an upstairs or just a bathroom. I want to do this legally. I want to go through the proper channels, and I think what we're asking is reasonable. And I don't want to subdivide. That wasn't anything we wanted to do when we bought this. We want to keep it as one lot. What people do in the future, I don't know, and I don't care. And as a board, you have the right to decide what they do. But at this point, I think what we're asking is reasonable. And like I said, I'll sign a deed. I'm not looking for rent. I'm not looking to. All this is going to do is increase our taxes, but that's a benefit to you folks. But we've thought long and hard on this, and this really is the best approach for us.
Other comments from the board? Sue?
Yes, I'm maybe personally not against it, and I can see where he doesn't want a second floor to it. I mean, if they want to be there as they get older, they don't want, have to deal with stairs. Okay. And if they've agreed to the fact that it's not going to be sold, but, after, he doesn't own it anymore, or his family, there's, nothing we can do to the future. But at the same time, I'm just looking at it reasonably too, where it looks as though, like Mr. Putnam, you've seen that there are these types of additional structures per lot that seem more common. And to say that we can't with him, but we did with others, doesn't seem right. And to already know that his family can take care of him, that I congratulate him on that one. And but I don't have any difficulties with putting this forward for him.
And Ms. Nastasi, just to correct the record a little bit, I note that these kinds of accessory apartments do exist. I'm not indicating that they have been created outside of the ordinance. I think there have been a number of, some by variance, some by, other processes.
Right. Okay, I understand. I just thought it was like, if others did it, how about them? But at the same time, he didn't want it to be a future sale after getting another structure.
Yep.
That's how.
Yep. Anybody else? I will hazard a guess that a motion to approve subject to conditions is the motion that the looks based on the deliberation so far is the motion that is most likely to succeed. It looks like the two conditions would be, or I guess three conditions. One, written representation from Mr. Martell that the accessory apartment would not be rented. And the second condition would be an agreement to place a deed restriction that the accessory dwelling unit would not be rented. And third, that the I'm guessing here because the board may or may not want to ask for the elimination of the garage bay. But those are the three conditions that I heard expressed. So is there somebody who wants to make a motion? I don't see any hands up.
Yeah, I'll make a motion.
Okay, and the motion is to approve?
Yes.
To grant the variance, subject to three conditions?
Yes.
Okay, and the three conditions, the written representation, the deed restriction, and the elimination of the garage bay?
Yes.
Before we go, if I raise my hand, can I understand the issue of the garage bay? I'm sorry. So we're saying that he would have to. Can I clarify before we vote? I'm sorry. What that is.
You guys are all of a sudden like, what's this very stuff on my hand?
We're getting a lot of static here. Mr. Martell, if you could mute your phone.
Okay.
Thanks. If you want to speak again, go ahead and unmute and let me know.
You mean it's press mute and it's the *6, right?
*6, yeah. John, I wasn't able to hear your last comment.
I'm a little bit confused before we vote. If they clarified for me, and I apologize, about the issue about the condition about the garage bay.
And that was a guess on my part, John. Mr. Leach pointed out the size of the expansion, and in an answer, question and answer exchange with Mr. Martell, he indicated a willingness that he would accept that condition. But I have not heard yet from a majority of the board that that's a condition that they want.
I don't have a problem with the garage bay.
Okay.
So that was Mr. Martell saying he agrees with that.
I'm sorry, John.
Maybe did I hear Mr. Martell say that he's okay with that third condition?
He did say he was not willing to reduce the size or to go on to a second floor. But in response to the question about it's more than doubling the size of the existing garage. That was the discussion. And Mr. Martell, if I have that wrong, don't hesitate to unmute and let me know.
He was responding. Sorry.
Mr. Leach?
Chairman?
Go ahead.
Oh, go ahead, Mr. Martell.
Okay, as far as the garage, I mean, obviously I would like to keep the garage, but if that's going to be a point of contention, we will eliminate it.
Okay.
The garage is not a point of contention with me.
Okay.
I just want to say before we vote, the garage isn't a problem for me. The legislature, as I understand it, may reduce the the burden, if you will, or make it more easy to accept an accessory, to have an accessory dwelling, given the limitations that he's indicating he's willing to accept, I would be willing to vote in favor without the third condition, but I'll go along with the board wants to do.
Ms. Nastasi, it's your motion. Do you want to have the third condition or remove the third condition? That's the one relating to the garage.
We can remove it.
Okay.
Oh, so did I do that? Yes, we can remove it.
All right. Mr. Ueda.
Are we deliberating the motion at this point?
I'm about to get a second for the motion. We just clarified what the motion would be. I'm about to find out if we have a second for the motion, and then we can debate the motion.
Would this be a better time? Then I have a comment on the conditions. You mentioned that he'd be willing to sign a deeded agreement or a restriction against renting the proposed apartment. Would it also be wise to include in that restriction, or in that deeded restriction, a prohibition against renting the main house?
I'm seeing a couple of heads. I'm seeing one head shake. I can't see Mr. Hinsman. So I don't want to speak for anybody else. I think the concern there is that there are situations where in a family relationship, sometimes an older person will get some rent from their house when they move into an accessory dwelling unit. So I think Mr. Leach had expressed the position that he didn't want to, and we'll take that off the table.
My clarification on that, do we have the right to attach a restriction to the primary house when this is a variance on an accessory dwelling unit? It seems a little of an overreach, in my opinion.
I think it's ultimately what the board and a court believes would be a reasonable condition. And sometimes boards, applicants, and abutters disagree about what a reasonable condition is. So it doesn't come with a good housekeeping seal of approval. This one's reasonable, this one is not. It's for the board through its deliberative process to decide which ones the board believes are reasonable. And then we are all subject to correction by the courts. Mr. Hinsman, I'm looking for a second first. Can you second the motion?
Sure. I'll second the motion.
Okay, and you have a comment.
So my comment was, based upon what you just said, Mr. Chairman, why couldn't we say, and I think the applicant will be agreeable with it, that unless the primary residence was rented by a family member who paid rent, that it could not otherwise be rented out. Right. That may be an appropriate time to talk to this thing because we're deliberating on the motion.
John, I'm really sorry. I couldn't make that out.
So I guess what I was, can you hear me better, Charlie, or not?
I can, yeah, thanks.
Okay, so I'm sorry. So I guess what I was saying, Charlie, is that as I hear you saying it, you think we could attach a condition to the primary residence that it not be rented except for by a family member of the resident. That would be a reasonable condition if that we could implement. That's my only comment. And I'm seconding the motion, but I'm also making that comment, which might be not particularly aligned to the motion.
I'll defer to Mr. Clark in a second, but I'll go constitutional nerd on you for a second. Restrictions that are limited to family are suspect from a constitutional standpoint. Defining what a family is in the 21st century and who is and isn't part of a family is a legal draftsman nightmare. And so I guess I would discourage, personally, unless the board knows how it wants to draft such a restriction, I'm not sure that I know a way to write it so that it has any work, any enforceability or real meaning. Mr. Clark, what have I missed?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I don't think you missed anything. I think the idea is to focus on the building, the accessory structure, and I have to agree with Mr. Leach that it's a bit of a reach to put a restriction on the main house or apply a restriction to family members.
Okay.
That's it.
Mr. Ueda.
I
Mr.
believe
Ueda.
I believe it's more important to place that restriction than it is on the proposed new unit. Again, if you go back to the spirit of an accessory dwelling unit being non-detached or attached, the assumption was you're probably not going to rent the unit that you just modified to someone other than a family member. They're living in very close proximity. And you certainly aren't going to go in the other direction and rent your main house back to some stranger when you live over their garage. But in this case, he's proposing basically to build another house. So there's even more incentive to rent your primary residence. For one, it will rent for more. It's a bigger, nicer house. It's a full house. So to me, it's even more important for that restriction. But, even with this deeded restriction, I'm going to vote against this thing. So it really doesn't matter. But I think if you're going to meet the spirit of the ordinance, that restriction is even more important. Because again, what would stop me from building a shed, throwing the shed to a garage, occupying it someday, and then renting my house? I've thought about doing that very thing. It would be economically wise, and it would be great, as I get older, just like Mr. Martell. It's a great idea. I'm sure lots of people would have that very same idea. But the ordinance doesn't allow it, so that's it.
All right. Are we ready for a vote? Anybody else with a comment? So this will be a roll call vote. A yes vote will be to approve the application for a variance from 8.1.3.9 of the Rollinsford zoning ordinance to allow the establishment of an accessory dwelling unit at 92 Old Mill Lane, subject to the condition that the applicant, Mr. Martell, and I don't know how the deed is written, but the owners of record execute an undertaking, an agreement with the town that they will not rent the accessory dwelling, and that they provide evidence that they've recorded a restriction, an appropriate restriction on the deed, that the accessory dwelling will not be rented by their successors, future owners of it. So a yes vote is to grant the variance, a no vote is to not grant the variance. And Ms. Nastasi, I'll start with you again.
Okay. I'm voting yes for the variance.
Okay. Mr. Leach?
I'm going to vote yes for the variance.
Mr. Hinsman?
Yes.
Mr. Ueda?
No.
And with apologies to my long-suffering companions on the board, I'm going to abstain. I'm struggling. I've been doing this for 2 years now, and I struggle with the unnecessary hardship element. But I have the luxury of abstaining here because my vote isn't going to change the outcome. So with that, do we have a volunteer to draft the board's order, even with help from the chair? All right, I can try to draft a draft order and send it around. I feel comfortable doing that unless the members of the board, again, where I've abstained, I didn't vote in the majority. I'll do my very best to write it up in an honest and fair way to reflect both the record and the deliberations of the board. Any objections to me taking the first swipe at drafting an order for you? Hearing none. All right. Oh, poor John left the meeting. All righty. We're moving on to the other items in our minutes. Minutes of the previous meetings. Do we have minutes that we need to approve, Sarah?
Yes. However, I don't know how you want to do this because we have minutes that haven't been approved that predate the current members of the board. So we do have minutes from the last meeting, which included all of the existing board members. It's up to you how you want to do that.
Let's take those first. I think that the current, we can't get the former board back to approve minutes. So
Right.
I think ultimately this board is going to have to just bite the bullet and approve minutes that predate it. But we still have recordings of those meetings.
Yes.
Yeah, so the recordings will probably speak for themselves. So let's take from the previous meeting. Is there a motion to approve our minutes, Mr. Clark?
I'm sorry to interrupt, Mr. Chair, but I just got a text from Mr. Hinsman. His battery died.
Oh.
Which is why he left so abruptly. He's rebooting.
Okay. So it wasn't something I said.
Correct. No, it wasn't.
All right.
So just to review, the meeting minutes that I have from 2020 are from April 23rd and from March 12th.
All right. And those have been circulated to the board?
Yes.
And have they been circulated to the members of the board that are here tonight?
Yes, I sent an email out with the link because they're all on the town's Google Drive. And I sent a link to all of the meeting minutes.
Okay. So first I would be looking for a motion to approve the minutes of the April 23rd meeting. Welcome back, John.
Sorry about that, my battery died.
Motion to approve.
All right. Motion by Ms. Nastasi to approve the minutes of the April 23rd meeting. Is there a second?
Second.
All right. Second by Mr. Ueda. Any discussion? Those in favor of approving, I have to go roll call again. Mr. Hinsman, in favor of approving the minutes of the April 23rd meeting?
In favor.
Stu Nastasi?
Yes, in favor.
Mr. Ueda?
All right.
And Mr. Leach?
I'm in favor.
Yeah, I also approve. So the motion to approve those minutes passes unanimously. And a motion, looking for a motion to approve the minutes of the March 12th meeting. And again, with apologies to the board members who weren't at that meeting, but my preference is for the board to just take action and approve the minutes. We have a backup recording of it, so if there's ever any legal dispute, somebody can go back to the recording.
I'd like a motion to approve.
Second that.
Okay, motion by Mr. Hinsman, seconded by Ms. Nastasi. We'll go in roll call order again. Mr. Ueda?
Aye.
And Mr. Leach?
In favor.
Ms. Nastasi?
Yes, in favor.
And Mr. Hinsman?
In favor.
And I'm also in favor. That motion carries unanimously. Thank you. And thank you, Sarah.
You're welcome.
Are there any other minutes? That's it.
Do you want to go back to 2019?
What's the pleasure of the board? We've had a hard time. We're hoping to go to monthly meetings, third Thursday of the month, so that we can better handle things like this. I don't want to put you in a bad position. At the same time, I think that approving minutes is something that you can do even if you weren't at the meeting. So it makes some people uncomfortable though, and I'm not trying to make anybody uncomfortable. So if you object to approving minutes for things that you weren't there for and weren't on the board for, I understand.
So, Sarah, we're talking about all the minutes for 2019?
Yeah, so just to refresh your memories. So we had cast towing, which was 1901 and 02. Turgeon, 1903. Lorax, 1904. And Knox Marsh, which actually got approved because it carried over to 2020. Let's see. The Lorax was a variance for Lance for the setback on one of the lots. And I don't know if you remember, he came back to try to get relief from that. He had somebody who wanted to build a different size house. Cast towing was an administrative appeal and a variance request. Cast towing the junkyard on Farnborough Road. And Turgeon was the duplex on Oak Street.
So I don't mind making a motion to approve. I'm not sure if other folks don't feel comfortable, as Charlie says. I don't know if Charlie and I were the only ones on the board throughout that case or Sue was on or not, but I'll make a motion for what it's worth to approve the entire 2019 minutes.
And we'll find out if there's a second.
I second that.
All right. And again, with apologies if you're uncomfortable with this motion, but any discussion on the motion to approve the minutes from the 2019 meetings and hearings of the board? Those in favor will go in roll call order again. Mr. Hinsman?
In favor?
Ms. Nastasi?
In favor.
Mr. Leach?
In favor.
Mr. Ueda?
I approve.
And I also approve. Thank you all. Unfinished business is the next thing. We have two draft orders from our last hearing, one for the Knox Marsh development and the other one on the daycare. Mr. Ueda was the only board member to submit comments on the Knox Marsh draft order. I thought his comments were excellent. I would recommend that the board include all of his recommended changes. And so what I would be seeking would be a motion to approve the Knox Marsh order as amended.
I'll make a motion that we approve the decision generously drafted by the chair and with the modifications by Mr. Ueda.
Okay, is there a second?
Second.
All right. Any discussion to approve that order? Those in favor of approving the order, again, I have to go by roll call vote. I'll start with Mr. Ueda.
Aye.
Ms. Nastasi.
Yes, approved.
And Mr. Leach, you were on the board for that. No, you weren't on the board for that one, right?
For the
He was.
Knox Marsh, I was.
Oh, for Knox Marsh, you were?
Yes.
Oh,
Oh,
okay.
no, you're right. I wasn't. I was
You were
on
on
the
the
date. I was not on the Knox Marsh.
So I'm not going to ask you for a vote on that one. Mr. Hinsman?
In favor.
And I'm also in favor. So Ms. Mears was the only one who wasn't able to approve that. And at our next meeting, let's discuss ordinarily e-votes are something we want to avoid, but I think in order to get our decisions out to applicants, we want to have some procedure where we don't have to wait till the next live meeting to approve an order. All right, Mr. Hinsman, you had an order, a draft order, and I don't think there were any comments on that order for the, was it 20 Mechanic Street or
It's
40
408 mechanic.
408 Mechanic?
408 mechanic.
And so I think I would be looking for a motion to approve the draft order as submitted.
Well, first, my deep gratitude for Charlie for completely assisting on that, and I'll make a motion to approve that.
Okay, is there a second?
Yeah, I second it.
All right, discussion on the motion to approve the draft order on 408 Mechanic. And we'll do it by roll call vote again. Mr. Leach, I'll start with you where I made you sit out the last one.
I'm in favor.
All right, Ms. Nastasi
In favor.
and Mr. Ueda
I'm in favor.
and Mr. Hinsman.
In favor.
All right. Is there any new business to come before us? I would like to just double check with those of you who are here. Ms. Kendall and Sarah and I had talked about trying to have, and somebody else recommended that we have a monthly meeting, a regular monthly meeting, so that we can just hold that date. That would have been June 18th. And so my question would be, is the board willing to meet on June 18th for assuming there are no hearings, for a workshop to just look at our board procedures, to talk about how we deliberate, to, questions or concerns about the cases that we've been handling. I want to avoid redeliberating those cases, but I know that we've had some really good discussion on at least what I thought was really good discussion. I hope nobody's feelings are hurt by disagreements or, differences in perspective. But I think it's been a very productive exchange of views and so forth. But to give the board a chance to talk about whether we want changes in our rules of procedure, to look at special exceptions and variances and ask questions and so forth. And Mr. Clark, I hate to impose on you, but if you could attend as well, we'd love your technical expertise.
Be happy to.
All right. So I'm going to take silence as assent. I don't see anybody shaking their head, looking like, let me out of here. All right. So June 18th, we'll have a meeting.
Yes.
And I'm going to
just wrote it down.
What time do you want to have it? 6 or 7?
Let's see. 7 is a little more convenient for me, but then the meetings go late. What's the pleasure of the board? Split it at 6:30?
I'd be happy with 6:30 or 7 either way. 6 it cuts it kind of close for me because I often am not done with my workday by 6. But so either way.
I say we stay consistent with 7.
Okay.
I'll
So
say
you-
6:30 or 7 with the majority.
Okay.
What
And
works?
Herb?
I'm completely indifferent.
Okay. 7 makes it a little bit more comfortable for me too. So let's stay with 7.
Okay.
I don't have much of an agenda in mind, but if you would send me questions or concerns that you would like us to talk about in that meeting, and I'll promise to keep it to no longer than 90 minutes. If we're not done by 8:30, we are done. All right, let me get back to my agenda. Is there any communications and miscellaneous? Nada. And any other business? And is there a motion to adjourn?
I move that we adjourn.
And
I'll second the motion.
all right, it's non-debatable. Those in favor of adjournment, say aye.
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 All right, and I'm not going to take a roll call on that. All right, thank you all very much.
Thanks.
Thanks,
Appreciate
guys.
it. Thank
I
you
would
very
say
much.
have a happy holiday weekend, but we're all staying home.
It'll
Thanks,
still be
Sarah.
happening.
Good job.
Oh, you're welcome.
Thanks, Sarah. Thanks, Tom.
Thank you, everyone. Good to see everyone.
Sarah, can I ask you a question before you hang up?
Yes.
So I'm on the Google, the ZBA Google Drive, I believe. I can see 19.05 Knox Marsh, the 2001 Lorax. Are minutes all included in that? I don't use Google Drive, so
Let me just confirm.
so I'm under ZBA applications.
Yeah, minutes. Each of those folders is every document related to that case, including minutes, notice, newspaper notice, everything.
Okay. So is there a way, well, let me just try one thing. Okay, got it. All right. Okay, so is that the only thing I'm looking at is just ZBA applications for 2020?
Yeah, so
Is there a way to go to 19?
so we just started kind of doing this. I have all the documents. I haven't, they're all with me, and I'm trying to put them on the drive so they're not all with me, but it just hasn't happened yet. There's one notice of decision, but
I just didn't know whether I wasn't seeing something.
nope, it's not you.
Okay, cool. Okay, cool. All right, thank you.
Yeah, you're welcome. Have a good night.
You too. Bye.
Okay, bye.